Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's talk. Glad to have a guest speaker from born and raised here at Mass General Hospital as part of his training, Dr. Daniel Katz, and I'm going to let Brian go ahead and make the introduction this morning.
Great. Many of you know me. I'm Brian Scotko. I'm the director of our Down syndrome program here at Mass General Hospital, and happy World Down Syndrome Day. So people with Down syndrome, as many of you know, have 3 copies of the 21st chromosome. And so symbolically on the calendar, 3/21 or March 21 is our day. So there's so many wonderful activities planned around the globe. And if you know someone with Down syndrome, please do celebrate them. If you haven't yet met someone with Down syndrome, it's an opportunity to get to know them through various activities. So it couldn't be more appropriate for us to be able to have grand rounds today dedicated towards people with Down syndrome. I'm hearing a little bit of echo. So if you are joining us today, if you could just put yourself on mute, that would be great. Or David, if you have the ability to control that. But I am so excited to present Dan Katz today. In 2017, which seemed like another planet ago, I was presenting at a conference related to disabilities here in Boston. And after I presented, there was a student who was attending, a medical student who flew into Massachusetts from his school, Case Western, and came up to me and asked a question. And that was Dan. And from that single question, I said, wow, this is someone who has grit. And Dan then said, is there a way, he followed up, that I could do some work with you in the Down syndrome program? And I said, yes, let's do it. And so this is just a reminder to all of us who are attendings that if you have a student who has grit, invest in them, because they will stay with you and produce enormous work, which is going to be evident today. And if you are a student or a training tuning in, take a cue from Dan. He is someone who leaned in and has developed a project that has gone a long way. Dan did his undergraduate at Brandeis University, and it's there that he developed a program to work with and for individuals with autism. That's where his interest in neurodiversity was really born. Like I said, from there he went to Case Western University Medical Center, where he started his medical career. After that, he came here to Mass General to do his pediatrics residency. And now, after his pediatric residency is done, he is now a first-year fellow in bioinformatics at Boston Children's Hospital. During all of this, he started the project that he's presenting today when he was a medical student, and now he is an attending, and you will recognize him as one of our pediatric hospitalists here at Mass General Hospital. He has led an international team for more than 5 years to work on this project. The stakeholders, many of whom are joining us today from around the world, represent 11 countries and 6 different continents. This is a project that was not paid by dollars, but paid by passion. And just at the beginning, I want to thank everyone for their very, very hard work on this. And with that, please welcome Dr. Dan Katz.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone understands the subtext of Brian just being an amazing mentor. And so I obviously did not do everything by myself, but it's been a real treat to work with him for so long. And so today is a really special day because it's World Down Syndrome Day and because we're publishing the first results from a survey we made that I'll talk about. So really big day. We're all really excited, and thanks for having me. I do not have any disclosures, and courtesy of the brief chat before the presentation started, I want to mention I did not use AI during any of this, and I myself am not AI. Before we start, a couple quick features for my slides. At the top, you'll see a very thin bar. That's your progress bar in case you want to know how we're doing time-wise. And at the bottom, I'll have citations with as many QR codes as I could fit in case you're interested in looking at any of the works we're doing. In the citations, any bolded names are MGH people. So today we're going to be talking about how to build a quality of life survey to measure, which was kind of the meat and potatoes of this project. And we'll also talk about why it matters to measure quality of life in people from around the world. Just some background. I know we're talking to genetics here, so I'm sure many of you are quite familiar, but one interesting thing about Down syndrome is the wide variability in its incidence. And so this is fairly recent data that Brian has gotten. Oh boy, I didn't bold him. That's my bad. Sorry, Brian. But in the US, we have 13 per 10,000 live births having Down syndrome, and in New Zealand at 6.9. And so wide variety, even though it's a genetic mutation, the most common live-born one, but a lot of this is impacted by the prenatal testing and availability of kind of Down syndrome knowledge prior to or during pregnancy, and so people can decide what to do with their pregnancies as a result. And in the US, this is a really lovely chart also that Brian oversaw, where you see the number of people within each age group who have Down syndrome who are currently living. And one thing I want to point out is if you look at the bottom, the youngest age group, the 0 to 4 age group, stays pretty consistent in terms of number. And so birth rate is actually going down as our population grows. The population of people with Down syndrome in that young age group stays the same. But the overall number of people with Down syndrome is just incredibly increasing, even past the point of what most people call a rare disease. And that just goes to show the incredible advances that have been made with healthcare and just overall care of people, with letting them to live much longer and hopefully overall better lives. And we'll talk about what I mean by better. And this kind of goes into that. So in the 1950s, the Down syndrome life expectancy was around 25, 26, and now we're into the 60s in high income, high resource countries. And typically when we talk about quality of life or how people are living, life expectancy is one of the first things we talk about, but there are other things that matter. And so I would love to have some interactive parts to this presentation. And so if you have thoughts about what else matters besides just life expectancy, both for people with Down syndrome and in other groups, please chat us. I'll be very curious as we talk about how we measured quality of life, whether or not we have some overlapping thoughts. And my hope is that we've captured all of your ideas in our survey, but if not, we're going to have future iterations, and we'd love to kindly borrow your ideas. And so keep that going as we keep talking. So looking at quality of life, Brian had this idea at the very beginning that we need a way to measure the quality of life of people with Down syndrome. And then when he said that, the loaded thing is, how do we do that? And how do we do it in an organized, methodical way? And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how can we stay organized? And one of the oldest, most well-established theories is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which he actually is another Brandeis guy. So that was a fun little tidbit for me. But we could have used other methods to stay organized, and there certainly have been many adaptations of Maslow's work that have expanded on it. But in the end, we felt that Maslow's hierarchy of needs was good enough to the point of we could stay organized and stay careful with how we were looking at quality of life. And so we went off with that and got into the actual fun part, which was coming up with all the categories and specific concepts that we wanted to. And so this was the first paper we published, which was just creating the survey. So what we did is we, as an international group of experts, and I'll get into that, but we had members from 11 different countries on a working group covering all 6 inhabited continents. And we met and just discussed people with Down syndrome. And some of these people were doctors, some people were family members, and some people were other sorts of advocates for people with Down syndrome. And some people like me were just people who were interested. And thinking about it, we came up with these 11 different concepts within Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And fortunately, each of the concepts we came up with fit into one of Maslow's groupings, and we covered all of his groupings. And so we felt fairly comfortable at this point that we had a very broad measure, or at least concept, of what quality of life is, and then we could dive into it. And I'll talk about this categorization. It did change over time, but this was how we first started. We also looked at existing measures for inspiration. One of our very first pieces of inspiration was this OECD Better Life Index. And that's the screenshot off to the right side, where you had these really beautiful little palm trees of different countries where their height showed their overall score, and then the size of each of these little leaves was their score within a particular domain of life or quality of life. And you can see the breakdown for Hungary, where you, if you hover over a country, you'll get this really nice little pop-up here. And on the right, there's also a really cool feature where you could change the weights of each of these domains. So if for you, housing is very important, you could crank up housing, turn down other things, and see if you wanted to live in a place that has really great housing, you could find out what that place is. And that's what we wanted to do with our surveys. We wanted a way to quantify quality of life, and not just in the general sense, but specifically what how do different countries do in terms of each of the different domains that we came up with. There are many other surveys that do the same thing. Kids Count is a US-based survey for children. The WHO has an elderly focused measure or toolkit. And Equaldex was another really fabulous resource that I want to point out specifically. It is made specifically for the LGBT plus community, and it has a website where you can click different things that might matter. So either different laws in terms of same-sex marriage, family planning rights, etc. And you can toggle between different maps and see how different countries do. The really interesting thing behind Equaldex is it's all crowdsourced, and so it's just regular people going out and updating their own countries and how they're doing. And one of the obvious questions with this was, why can't we just use one of those existing surveys? And it's because Down syndrome is not like any other condition. There certainly is much overlap between Down syndrome and other issues, but there are many Down that we. One little example, just within healthcare, a stunning people syndrome health problems in the generation. This from a really
Dan, let me just tune in. I don't know if it's me, but your audio is going in and out. Are people getting the same? Yeah.
That's a whopping bummer. Let me call in off of my phone, and then at least if my video is funky, my voice won't. Sorry about that, everyone.
Yeah, take your time.
Second. Forget that law, but something has to go wrong, right?
This is it. It's only minor. While you call in, Dan, I will do some background for this slide. So the International Down Syndrome Community does organize a World Down Syndrome Congress. And short of the pandemic, this was occurring every 2 years and will resume again this year. We'll all be going to Australia for the conference. But back in 2018, we were in Glasgow, Scotland for the World Down Syndrome Conference. And I had this kind of idea ruminating in my mind, and I decided to get together with some of the leaders here for coffee. And many of you know, at conferences, some of the best ideas are not born during the workshops or the major plenary presentations, but during those coffee chats. And this is a photo that we snapped of the original individuals who said, yes, this crazy idea, let's go for it. And so many of these individuals continued to work on this project for 5 years. So just a shout out to all of the original folks who believed in this project. And this is the shot again from that historic moment. And Dan, I think we have you back online.
Sure am. Yeah, so this was kind of the birth of this whole project, where Brian met this crack squad of Down syndrome experts and really laid the foundation for this project. And sorry, Brian, I missed some of what you were saying. Are we good to move on to the next slide, or do you have anything else you want to say?
You're free to move on. I took that slide.
Fabulous. And just for a fun little countdown, or count up, I guess, this was 2,065 days ago from today. So long, long, long project. Really exciting to see it go so long. And before we actually get into the specifics of how we made our survey and how we used it to measure quality of life of people with Down syndrome, I want to talk about the logistics that went into making the survey, just because there were a lot and was very interesting for me to see as a little med student, kind of all of the thoughtfulness and planning that went into this project. So the first thing was that we had to submit an IRB. Like any research project, we were declared exempt, but the IRB was very helpful in helping us come up with our recruitment materials and kind of thinking through the specific methodology of our survey. We also developed memoranda of understanding. And so what we did in order to distribute our survey to make sure we had the largest reach possible is we partnered with 4 different international organizations of Down syndrome organizations, and they distributed our survey to their members. And so with each of these umbrella organizations, we had a memorandum of understanding where we spelled out the schedule on which they were supposed to send out their recruitment emails, but we also importantly included that they would not see any of our results, they would not see our paper, and so they were purely for recruitment, and we were trying to stay as separate as possible from them aside from that. And then the IRB helped us come up with this recruitment letter and fact sheet where we promised organizations we'd give them some degree of anonymity and would not reveal them by name. Of course, some countries only have one or Down syndrome organization, and so they're not truly anonymous there, but we did the best we could to try and encourage people to fill out our survey without worrying that the results will somehow get back to them or affect them in a negative way. And one of the really exciting logistics of this was coordinating meetings. So our working group had members in each of these countries that you see here on the map. And so coordinating meetings that worked for everyone was incredibly challenging. I think from what I remember, our most popular meeting time was 7 a.m. on either a Saturday or a Sunday, Boston time. But for some of our collaborators, you know, it was during the work week, it was after the workday when they're tired, et cetera, et cetera. And so just really incredible seeing how passionate everyone was to attend the meetings and give their input. And even if they couldn't attend, we would email, and it was a really fabulous collaboration with a really, really motivated group of people. And then one of the foundational questions we had to decide on was, who do we ask about quality of life? And I've kind of spilled the beans already and told you all that we ended up surveying advocacy organizations, but we also could have targeted family members of people with Down syndrome or people with Down syndrome themselves. We chose not to do that because we wanted country level data, and we felt that advocacy organizations were in a really specific place where they likely had a pretty good feel of their whole countries, and especially in terms of policies, laws, other governmental supports. And so we wanted that large overview. We do wish we could have surveyed people with Down syndrome. That was just too much of an undertaking for an unfunded project, where we would have had to find ways to reach all of these people. And so for us, we felt that the Down syndrome organizations were a nice proxy. And I'll talk about our inclusion criteria too, and how we tried to really make sure they're the best proxy possible. So now we're getting to the actual survey. So to come up with our survey questions, we used a modified Delphi method. And so that's where our working group came got its job, is we had monthly meetings. We talked about possible questions. At the very beginning, what we did is we looked at all of these existing quality of life measures and surveys that have been published. We compiled as many indicators as we could find into one whopping spreadsheet that my computer did not enjoy working with. And we just started plucking through and saying, oh, this is an interesting concept. We should think about measuring this. Here's another one. Here's something that isn't so relevant, et cetera. And so we ended up with 140 indicators that Brian, I, Karen, and the rest of the kind of core group proposed to the working group as a whole. And by the end, we had whittled it down to 61 items on our final survey. And I'll get into that process. In terms of our meeting schedule, I think it was just interesting to see how we met on a calendar. And so we started in 2018. That little birthday cake in July symbolizes Brian's meeting in Scotland. The little waving hand in November is when I said hello to the whole team. So I had really incredible time, enjoyed very early on, and got to see almost the entire process. And then one thing that I really want to point out is that we worked through 2020. And so even though COVID really stopped the world, because we were already meeting virtually on random schedules, we just kept doing that. And this working group also served as a really nice sort of support system where we could check in with each other, see how we're all doing. We, in the early days, didn't know how COVID would affect people with Down syndrome. And so we could ask people around the world what their countries were doing, what they've been hearing. It was really interesting to be part of those conversations. And then that little detective icon I had in July of 2020 is when we started reviewing our survey. So everything before then was just picking the indicators and the general structure of our survey. And then afterwards, the rest of those meetings were reviewing, refining, editing. And then we continued to meet afterwards to kind of talk more about papers and publication. But the meat and potatoes of our work was done during this calendar. And so now we're getting to the kind of interesting part of our first paper, which is how do we know that an indicator is good and what does that mean? So we came up with 3 relatively simple criteria to help us decide. So one, if you ignore the exact wording of the indicator as we were proposing it, would the concept behind that indicator be helpful to know to help us understand and quantify quality of life of people with Down syndrome? And we rated that on a Likert scale, either very unuseful, unuseful, neutral, useful, or very useful. And similarly, on a Likert scale, how easy would it be for your organization to answer this question, acknowledging that some of these things might be very helpful to know, but there's just no way we would be able to measure it. And the way we weren't looking for exact numbers. We didn't want anyone to respond and say 81% of our population has access to a job or public funds for people with Down syndrome. We just wanted a general gist of is it most people or few people? And so we used pretty small Likert scales, but still, do people even have an idea of how they could respond to a survey containing that question? And lastly, if the wording was not perfect of this question, which very frequently it was not, how would you change the wording? And this is where our working group came in incredibly useful. We had people from all around the world speaking different primary languages. And so hearing everyone's input into what exact phrasing was most easy to understand for them was great. And I think had a really big impact on why our survey ended up having really impressive completeness in our data. And so I want to go through an example with you all just to show exactly how our meetings would run. And so for our meetings, we'd have pre-work. So we would pick a domain of indicators. So for example, the healthcare domain, we would create a survey that we would send out asynchronously with each of those 3 questions for each indicator. And we would ask all of our working group members to rate all of our indicators for each of those questions. And so it was a lot of work for everyone, and that's why we met once a month, is to give everyone time to fill out those surveys. And then we would meet and talk about it. And so I want you to think about this indicator as an example. So how many children with Down syndrome are generally loved and accepted by their immediate family members? And I would love for you to chat in, or if you don't want to, just think about how useful would that be to know for you if you wanted to measure quality of life of people with Down syndrome? And regardless of whether or not it's useful, how easy would it be for you to answer that if you were a representative of a Down syndrome organization? So how many children with Down syndrome are generally loved and accepted by their immediate family members? And I'll stop talking for a little bit so you all can process and think and kind of play with the wording. And I'll pick up in, let's say, like 30 seconds. right, I think that's long enough, so we can keep going. So looking at actually what happened to this indicator in our process, here's just the results of whether or not this was useful. And so our group had 9 responses, and number of responses varied month to month. But for this particular indicator, we had 9 responses, and everyone said it would be useful to know this. In terms of that mean number right there of 3.3, the way we calculated that was we just assigned point values to each of these categories. Not useful was 1 point, somewhat useful was 2 points, useful was 3 points, very useful was 4 points. And so the mean there was 3.3, and we had a pretty small standard deviation, which you can just see from looking at the numbers too. So that's great, but then the next step was, could we actually measure this? And people, I think, to me, reading this question in hindsight, it's interesting that people thought this was pretty easy to measure and not quite as great as positive as the previous question, but for the most part, it seemed like this was also fairly easy for people to measure. And so in terms of when you build a survey, you want the questions to matter, you want them to be measurable, and so this met both of those criteria, which was awesome. And so it looks like this is a question we should include in our survey. Spoiler alert, we did not actually end up including that. And I'll get to that in a second. But so here are some of the comments that our working group members had. So they wondered, how can you actually measure love? That does not seem particularly measurable. And then also, how many children with Down syndrome live in a family? How many of those families are using available resources to support their families? Because that also presumably can impact how able families are to accept family members with Down syndrome. And then one person said they would either choose this or the previous question, but not both. And I'll get to what that previous question was. And so when we actually met to go over those responses, our group discussion was pretty similar. We said this is similar to the previous question, and so we should keep one of them. And so the previous question was, how many children with Down syndrome are generally viewed as an embarrassment or stain by their immediate family members? So slightly different wording, getting at a slightly different problem, but generally the same concept. And so that is actually the question we stuck with for our survey. Zoom out, we did this for a whole lot of questions. So this is one row of our spreadsheet, and Brian knows that I deeply love spreadsheets. And so this was a just thrilling project for me. And so taking a snapshot of our spreadsheet, this is just as much as it would fit on my computer screen of one of our spreadsheets. And so you can see different indicators going down all the rows. And then the columns are, here we have the usefulness ratings, we have the easiness ratings, we have comments, and then we also have the notes from the group discussion. And we have coloring by mean and standard deviation, so we could quickly see which indicators stuck out. And we had coloring of I think it was the top 5 questions in each category would get highlighted. And then if questions were highlighted in both categories, the question itself would get highlighted. So as you can tell, I had way too much fun making these spreadsheets, but it really helped us crunch through all of that data. And so overall, we started with 140 proposed indicators. And one thing to mention too is during our meetings and conversations, we would also come up with new indicators outside of our 150 proposed indicators. And sometimes we just felt like we had to measure something that we weren't capturing otherwise. And so we would just come up with something from scratch. We had 13 separate spreadsheets where we rated all of our 140 indicators. We had then 2 more spreadsheets and surveys where we reviewed all of the indicators we had already selected and chosen, just to really make sure we were happy and didn't have any more wordsmithing. Let me tell you, we wordsmithed endlessly. Frequently, we would get through maybe 5 indicators in one meeting and would have to push to the next week to finish off the domain. And that is why we had about 2 years of meetings to just create the survey. And so we ended up with our final group of 61 items in our survey. Looking at, going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, each of our indicators was within one of the 11 initial domains, but we ended up recategorizing them into 5 domains just for simplicity. And one of the best happy accidents I've had is that our final 5 domains ended up being very similarly sized in terms of how many indicators were within each one, and that was purely by luck. We were thinking that we might have to do some rearranging, paying special attention to that, but it just ended up that way, which was great. But so we ended up with education, community inclusion, independence, healthcare, and social and policy issues. Our thought behind social and policy issues was that this would be a fairly reliable indicator where either a country has a certain law or it doesn't, and it should be fairly easy for countries to answer, while other things like community inclusion and independence might be a little tougher. And so that way we could balance out how difficult were our indicators to answer, and can we capture really everything relating to people with Down syndrome. So now we have our survey. We've decided that it's easy to answer and helpful to know the answers too, but we still want to make sure that from an outside perspective, for people who haven't been talking about this for 2 years, that it's still, the words make sense and they're answerable. And so we reached out to these 7 organizations in these countries to pilot test our survey. And we specifically chose countries where there were multiple Down syndrome organizations, so that if we used a pilot organization, we could then use the other organization for our final version of the survey. We did invite all of our pilot organizations to fill out the final version, but we did not just carry forward the pilot results because some of our indicators did change. The changes were very small, but we wanted to be very clean and careful about how we got our data, and so we excluded the pilot results. But overall, feedback was pretty good. We had a pretty complete results. We had some more wordsmithing we did, but it was really lovely to go through that process and get kind of that real feedback. So then we moved to the recruiting portion of our study, which I briefly went over, but we partnered with these 4 umbrella organizations, so organizations of Down syndrome organizations, and we asked each of these to distribute our survey. There was one other umbrella organization that we reached out to, but they were very preoccupied with their COVID efforts. Our recruitment was during 2020 or 2021 is when we were thinking about all these things. And so they did not participate in this first iteration, but we still were able to capture many different countries in at least our recruitment efforts. Not everyone participated, but we actually ended up getting 55 organizations that responded to our survey and were included in our survey, met the inclusion criteria, which was, at least for me personally, better than I expected. Getting 55 respondents within 50 countries in the world sounded like a really great percentage, especially knowing that our survey was only in English. And I'll get to our limitations and future directions, but that was a major roadblock that really limited who could answer our survey. Our inclusion criteria were fairly straightforward. We really cared about 2 things. We wanted to know that the Down syndrome organization responding to the survey had a holistic focus, meaning was not just a dance group or did not have one specific goal with respect to people with Down syndrome, but really focused on their lives overall. And we also wanted people with Down syndrome to be represented adequately. And so we said we want at least half of the organization's members to either have Down syndrome or be family members of people with Down syndrome, realizing that we cannot survey those people directly, but we wanted them very well represented with this organization rather than it being someone on some pedestal looking from afar. We wanted someone who's really living the day-to-day issues of people with Down syndrome. So overall, here are all the participants of our survey. We had 75 organizations fill it out. We ended up including 55 organizations in 50 countries. The green participants are the ones who were included. The red were excluded. Interestingly, just to point out, Ukraine was excluded, and one of our working group members was from Ukraine. And so we didn't kind of I think that just speaks to how blindly we were doing this. We really did not let that impact anything. And even though we all wanted to include her, we said, here are our inclusion criteria, we're sticking with it. And, you know, in hindsight, things have obviously changed in Ukraine since we administered our survey. So I'm not sure how helpful those results would be in hindsight, but just wanted to point that out. In terms of our data, I just have a quick sample of what it looked like. And so this is for the community inclusion domain. We have two indicators here. These are the ones we measured on yes, no scales. Green is the number of yes respondents, red is the number of no respondents, and then gray is do not know. And the white, which you can barely see because there's only one person, just did not answer and skipped the question. And so one of the things to look at here is that there, at least from this small sample, looks like there's a good spread in the data. So we did a good job of stratifying countries. If everyone had answered yes to a certain question, it wouldn't be particularly helpful. We had, I believe, two questions that stick out, at least in my mind, that were like that and had a large proportion of yes respondents, very few other answers. And so it didn't particularly help with differentiating countries. And then to get to what actually happens with these people who skipped answers, we just did not include them in that domain. So if you did not fully answer all of the questions, you received scores, just not a score for that specific domain. And to get an overall score in our survey, you had to get a valid score for each domain. And so whatever country that was did not receive an overall score, did not receive a community inclusion score, but received scores for every other domain. And every single of our included countries received scores in at least 4 of our 5 domains. Again, speaking to how complete our data was. If you answered do not know, we categorized you as the kind of lowest ranking group. So in this case, you'd be categorized as a no answer. We also tested the effects of categorizing you as somewhere in the middle. So between a yes or a no, we coded yeses as 1s and nos as 0s. And so for a do not know, we tried giving a 0.5 towards your score. But we found that doing that or scoring you just as a 0 didn't make any difference. And so we just stuck with scoring as a 0. This is a similar chart just for questions that use different scales. So we have none or few, some, many, most, or all, and then the same don't know, didn't answer. And you can see here, everyone answered these questions. No one skipped, no one said, I don't know. We were able to get a really nice spread in the data for each of these. And then came the really fun part where we had to actually convert all of these charts and pretty spreadsheets into scores. And so this was a 5-step process led by Karen Donnellan, who's a senior survey methodologist at Mass General at the time, is now also working at Brandeis University as her full-time job. And also working with Shovik, who was a statistician that started at MGH, but had relocated to India by the time of us doing all this work. But that's how Karen knew him and got him involved. And so he performed factor analysis where the idea is you have so many different variables, you want to reduce them into as few dimensions as possible. And so you want to find a way to weight the variables to make them into one kind of super variable that is able to explain most of the differences between countries. And I'm sure this explanation is going to be an oversimplification, and Karen might have some thoughts, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. As these numbers here ended up being the weights for each of these questions. And so presumably proportion of people using negative language, because it had a relatively high weight, also had a pretty good spread in the data where we could use it to differentiate different countries. The next step was we normalized our indicators. I had showed that we, in the previous couple of charts, that we used different scales for our questions. And so we wanted to normalize them such that the mean of every single question was 0 and the standard deviation was 1. And that way we could compare and manipulate the different indicators together. And so we were able to add them up, and I'll get to that in a second. So now we have our scores, we have our weights for the scores, and we can combine these into a domain score for each organization. So we went through each domain for each organization and we multiplied the factor loading, which is that weight that I mentioned, with their actual numerical score. So again, if they were a yes on a question, their numerical score would be a 1, which we then normalized into a z-score. We multiplied that by the factor weighting, and then we added up all of the different indicators within each domain to get the domain score. For countries that had multiple respondents, we averaged the domain scores of the participants. And for the overall score, we just added together all the domain scores. And the reason we were strict about if you didn't answer a domain, you weren't able to get an overall score is because of this, that you would kind of have a falsely decreased score if one of the domains was missing. And so we made sure that we had full data for the countries that we gave overall scores to. There were 45 countries out of our 50 that ended up getting overall scores, so we did not miss out on much data there. Lastly, we put together maps of each of our domains in terms of what the scores were, just because we wanted, going back to Equaldex that I mentioned earlier, we wanted a worldwide map of the quality of life of people with Down syndrome. And so each domain got its own color, and the degree of coloration, the darker the color, the higher the score. So Australia, you can see, is very dark, while you can see some of these countries, kind of South America, Africa, are lighter, they have lower scores, and then some countries are very light. That just means that they did not receive a score for this domain, but received scores overall and were included in the study. And lastly, these dark gray countries were filled out the survey, but were excluded. And so for community inclusion, we found that the UK, Ireland, Sweden, Switzerland, and Singapore were the highest scoring of all of our participants. For education, we found Italy, UK, Malta, Spain, and Canada were scored particularly well. I will say that all of our scores were very smooth, kind of gradients from low scoring to high scoring. We did not have clear bins of here are the best countries, here are the worst countries. We had a very smooth transition among all of our participants. And so I really hesitate to say that here are the best countries, here are the worst countries. Instead, here are countries that scored a little better than the others. And I'll get to the kind of specific interpretation of that, just because we want to be very careful with how we interpret these findings, to not put down any countries or kind of reprimand anyone. We also don't want to gloat, but we want to use this productively, and I'll get to that. One of the interesting things about education was that, as you can see, Malta came out very well, which Malta is a smaller country in terms of population, in terms of economics. And so it was interesting to see that you didn't necessarily have to have buckets of money or population in order to score highly. That was the general trend, but not a rule, which was great. In healthcare, we saw Netherlands, Canada, Italy, UK, and Switzerland performed well. I will point out that I'll get into the US specifically, but just notice the difference in coloring between the US and Canada. So the US did not score particularly well in healthcare, which I think was quite a shock to some of our working group members. Independence, similarly, UK, Canada, Spain, Italy, and Germany did well. And so in general, as I'm flipping through, you can see trends that Europe and North America are doing overall quite well, versus Africa, Asia are not doing quite as well. And lastly, policy and law. Pakistan, Estonia, Germany, Canada, Italy, and the Netherlands were our high scorers. And again, Pakistan and Estonia really stuck out as being relatively smaller countries that were doing a great job in terms of policy and law for people with Down syndrome. So really great to see that, particularly as we think about, can we learn from these countries? And so you don't, the learning point does not have to be, oh, just go and get more money, because you can't. Instead, we can still learn from each other in terms of what are these countries doing with their resources that we can try and adopt. And then lastly, here's our big overall map. And so this is taking all the scores together. And so the UK, Canada, Italy, Netherlands, and Spain were at the top of the charts for us. The US, just because I'm sure everyone's interested, was really not at the top. They were, relatively, we did well. but in healthcare and especially in policy did not, which was quite surprising, and really just speaks to the fact that we are not done doing our work, our advocacy. We really have a long way to go, and that's kind of why days like today, World Down Syndrome Day, are so important. Lastly, one of our big goals was to use this for advocacy efforts, and so a paper in the journal is not publicly accessible necessarily, and is hard to access for advocacy organizations. And so we have published our results to a website, ds-4s.com. That stands for the name of our survey, Down Syndrome Structures and Supports Survey.com. Also Down Syndrome and Quality of Life.com, but that is a handful to say. And so we have a quick overview of what we did on this website. We have all of our maps where you can choose the different data sets. Right now we have one data set. We also have a separate data set called our well-being or general well-being indicators, which was a baseline measure of how countries are doing for the general population, because maybe they're doing really well or really poorly for people with Down syndrome, but they have a really either high or low quality of life overall for the general population. And so if people with Down syndrome are doing relatively the same as everyone, but the country's doing very poorly as a whole, that's important to know, versus if people with Down syndrome are doing, say, poorly relative to the general population, but the general population is doing very well, that's also important to know. And so you can toggle between those data sets. I intentionally, just for the sake of time, did not talk much about our well-being indicators in this talk, but they were done similarly to our main survey. And then you can also toggle between different domains and see the map change. If you click on a country, or if you click on the country data tab, you get a breakdown of the whole country. And so for Canada, you'll see their overall ranks and scores. And then if you scroll down, you'll actually see how they responded to every single question in our survey. There's a button to request access to the survey so that we can start building our recruitment effort for the next iteration. There's a method section where I, in layman terms, try and explain what we did. Brian just put a link to this website in the chat. And then we also have publication citation information where really happily today I'll be adding today's new paper. And so going back to think about why we did all of this, the basic goal was we just wanted to improve the lives of people with Down syndrome. Whenever Brian consents patients for research in clinic, he says our goal is to make tomorrow a little better than today, and that's always stuck with me as the goal. And so we just want to help people advocate for people with Down syndrome and kind of keep building. And so we want to identify specific needs. And so for the US, now we know we need more advocacy in policy specifically and with healthcare. And we can really focus in on specific issues where we need to grow. And we can also identify best practices. So we can go to the high achieving countries and say, what are you doing? And how can we learn from that and adapt it to our own countries? In terms of limitations, I mentioned this, but we surveyed organizations, and we also only surveyed one representative from each organization. And so over time, as we repeat the survey, we'll have a more robust data set where we will just kind of more confidently be able to say that this is true, not some sort of bias or error in our survey. And then I also want to acknowledge countries have variability within them. You know, growing up in Boston, Massachusetts is going to be very different than growing up in rural Wyoming in terms of your quality of life. And so there is certainly variation within countries, but we did our best to capture countries as a whole. In the future, we're going to be repeating the survey, both in its current state and also with, we can change indicators as time goes on. We are going to be looking into funding to get translations of the survey because we really would love to make this more accessible to more people. We're going to try and recruit multiple organizations per country. And we want to do some of the work of interviewing the high scorers for their best practices and publishing those also on our website for organizations to have access to. And so I want to acknowledge all of the people involved in the study. Brian and Karen were the PIs or are the PIs in the current tense and have really, really been incredible to work with. And I've learned so much. The people on the left are all the authors of the most recent paper. The people on the right are people who are still part of our working group, just were not formally recognized as authors. And then on the bottom are the four sort of umbrella organizations that helped us recruit people. And then some just personal acknowledgements. Obviously, thank you to all my family, friends, co-trainees. Huge thank you to the Ruderman Inclusion Summit for introducing me to Brian. And then huge shout out to both my residency and fellowship leadership for all of their support and incredible mentorship. And with that, here's a URL and QR code for our new paper that has just come out this morning. And I think Brian wanted to do a little wrap up.
Dan, thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's clear to all of us how much passion you put into it then and now. And just to highlight one of the comments that Karen put into the chat, if you all missed it, the website that Dan so quickly went through, he built it. And so for a project that's built by passion, Dan also did the programming, put it together. It's interactive, it's great. Dan, I can't thank you enough on behalf of all of us around the world for putting this together. And like you mentioned, this is the beginning. And so in many ways, we have just begun. And the goal and the hope is that while all countries have room for improvement, we hope to be able to document and measure that improvement as advocacy efforts around the globe continue to unfold. But I'm sure people have some questions or some comments, and we will either open up the mics, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, or feel free to put a question in the chat. While people are doing that, Dan, I'm sure you're seeing your colleague Nina Gold is saying the website's easy to use and great. So plaudits there.
Yeah, shout out to Nina for being a great cheerleader in general.
Great. Angela, I want to make sure I give you space. I see you put a couple of comments. I'm not sure if you wanted to turn them into questions, but just giving you space if you wanted that space.
Brian and Dan, really amazing presentation. Love the way you taught us all by going over methodology. I guess I always think about the voices that are not included in activities like this. These type of groups, we call them support groups, consumer advocacy groups, advocacy. So there's a real positivity about it, which is obvious. But I think of the parents who have lost a child, an adult or a child for whatever reason. Do they still participate in these type of groups? Because they bring the voice of what might be considered sort of the downer tone. In other words, is this sort of bias towards relentless positivity and relentless, that I made the question about, wow, that comment about the negative, that was those are such strong terms. I could barely read it to hear that disdain, embarrassment, rather than something that just said something benign, like it's really difficult, So I'm not trying to be critical. It's just that, and when I look at the organization, the countries that participate, there's certain countries that are not represented because they're ones that I saw that have the highest termination rate. I saw Iceland was not present, France, nor Denmark. So, and I'm thinking about the disorders I work with. Parents are really scared of some of the rare but devastating problems, aortic dissection, cardiomyopathy, and stuff like that. Thank you for listening. Sorry to ramble.
Thank you, Angela.
I completely agree. Thank you so much. And I will say we definitely don't want to exclude people like that. We really relied on self-report. So if there was a family member of someone who passed away, they still call themselves a family member of someone with Down syndrome, they count. We actually had a person who fits that on our kind of inner working group. And so I hope we did a good job of capturing them, but I completely agree.
I'll just add, one of the most powerful parts for me for this was setting our expectations aside and letting our stakeholders really help guide the project. And one of our key stakeholders represented the African countries and lives in Africa and has a child with Down syndrome. And that particular question, I remember Rose advocating for the use of stain to be in it because that was culturally resonating with some of the countries that she worked with. And she would describe on the phone how in many countries still to this day, when a child with Down syndrome is born, it's considered, quote, a stain, and the child is abandoned. And so even questions that in some of our more well-resourced countries, we consider we're far past that, it is still the stage where they are. So we wanted to, again, make sure that the language, which is so hard in English, universally understood across the globe, but some of the language was specifically resonating with some of those countries.
Thank you, Brian. That's very interesting. You know, I want to congratulate you on what I hear is your forthcoming presentation to the United Nations. A little shout out to that accomplishment. How will you digest these research studies into a message for them? I'm just curious. Can you give us some highlights?
Yeah, later today, I'm in New York. As many of you know, United Nations has a special day celebrating World Down Syndrome Day. There'll be a variety of speakers, more importantly, including people with Down syndrome and their family members. I will also have an opportunity to present. I'm going to present some of the epidemiological data that Gert de Graaf on this call and I and Frank have been working with. I'll talk about the quantity and then talk about the quality. But then I'm also going to talk about Down Syndrome Clinic to You. So one of our ways of trying to provide a solution and democratize healthcare. So no matter where you are, as long as you have access to the internet, you could have access to up-to-date information. So there'll be a quick overview and happy to share those slides and video with people afterwards. We have a minute or two left, and Karen, I see your hand is raised, so I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I just want to echo, everyone on how remarkable a team this is and has been to work with for me as a survey researcher. To Angela's issue, I've been saying to Brian since I met him, when are we going to survey the people with Down syndrome? And what I've learned is, to sort of step into this. So I want to also give a shout out to Stephanie Santoro, who I think is on here somewhere, whose K Award is looking at quality of life for people with Down syndrome, especially engaging caregivers and people with Down syndrome in her work. Brian and I worked on another project in the pandemic in group homes for people with intellectual and developmental disability. We have data directly from residents of those group homes. So I think our increasing efforts to democratize our data, to push these instruments and the data out there so that people can use them are really exciting to me. And this is a long journey we're on, but a really exciting one. So, and Angela, I do work in aging and serious illness as well. So the experiences of families of people with Alzheimer's are of special interest to me and to Dr. Christine Ritchie, with whom I work in the Center for Aging and Serious Illness at MGH. So happy to talk about that another time too.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for your guidance, leadership, and thoughtfulness all throughout the project. And David, we'll let you have the final word.
Yep, we're up against the hour, but just kind of a quick comment. This is a really wonderful body of work. I guess intrinsic in some of the original questions you had, as Angela had mentioned, are kind of a bit loaded. Is your child loved, for instance? You wonder how the implication is, and not to detract from that Down syndrome individuals are very special, very special group of individuals. The question is how would this compare across the spectrum of genetic diseases, and how would the quality of life vary? And is there some way you could place a Down syndrome amongst some of the other categories? I know that's a really hard question to ask or get at, but if there are some limited questions that could be distributed somehow, would be interesting.
Yeah, I would just say, like all that we do, we hope that if any of this could be a blueprint or a template for others, please use and take. So as part of our published papers, we have published the entire set of survey questions. So for all of you who have passion in other genetic specific domains, please use them, adapt them, don't have to start from scratch. And of course, Dan, Karen, and I are always available offline for any ways that we could be of help. With that, happy World Down Syndrome Day to everyone. Thank you, Dan. I hope everyone has a great day.